I have asked if the laptop could be moved here so I don't turn my back to you as I read the slides. In that moment that we have while they're adjusting, I want to sincerely thank the hosts of this conference for the opportunity to be here. It is in forums like this that we activate the energy that we need to work together to make changes in policy and practices that make a difference in the lives of people with disabilities. And it's only with this collective energy where we learn from each other that we really can make the kind of progress that we want to make. Is that difficult to make the move? Okay. Okay. Do you want me to just work? Yes, sure, I can do that. The problem is, I don't know if they'll be able to. Sure. I'll do that. Okay, I'll speak from over here. I was trying not to block any of the subtitles. All right, let's do that. Thank you. Thanks for adjusting for me. All right, so I'm going to speak from research we're conducting at Cornell University. I come from the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University, and I want to first tell you a little bit about my context that I come from, where we're conducting this research, and then also a bit about, thank you, a bit about the context where we conduct the research, and then I will go right to the content. We're a land grant institution at Cornell University. This is what we look like now. In the winter, it is all white, but right now we have beautiful colors on our campus for autumn. We have been around for 150 years now, and we're a land grant college, which means that we have a responsibility to make sure that our research goes out to the world, which is part of the mission of why I want to be here today. We have 17 undergraduate and graduate school colleges, 26,000 students, 21 libraries, 100 graduate fields, and 80 formal majors. I'm in an institute within the School of Industrial and Labor Relations that focuses on employment and disability, and it works to advance inclusion and full participation of people with disabilities in the workplace. That's our main focus, but also in the community more broadly. Our work is research, training for many different constituencies that I'll name, and technical support to provide knowledge for disability inclusion. This is a part of our staff. There's 62 member staff. We're very multidisciplinary. And we're a unit that works on contracts and grants and fees from the federal and state government to do the work that I will describe with you. We have many target audiences, and I will say all of these people are important to making true change for people with disabilities. People with disabilities themselves, who should be the main spokesman for what they want, family members of people with disabilities, disability service and advocacy organizations, policymakers, well represented here today, which I'm delighted to see, government agencies, employers' unions. We work with schools at all levels and also communities. The city of Taipei can be very proud of taking this initiative because it is at the grassroots level that change really must occur. The goal of my time with you today is to provide an overview of the elements of effective change in improving employment outcomes for people with disabilities, including select public policy and workplace policies and practices to highlight the effective ones for the workplace, discuss the importance of public, private, and community partnerships in this process, and to share resources for future reference, and most importantly for me, to hear from and learn from others who are so well represented here today. First of all, a little broader picture I will start with, and that is that there are many elements that are needed for true effective change in getting people with disabilities into the workplace and into our communities equitably with others. So those elements in my mind are public policy that support inclusion at all levels, educational preparation, including work experience and higher education, public sector employment supports, corporate employer engagement, and community and family supports. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about workplace policies and practices, which is where I conduct research and we have focused at our institute. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the policy context just a bit within which these efforts sit. First of all, we have federal workplace non-discrimination requirements that came about 50 years ago with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And there are many facets to it, but the two I will mention right now, because it has, I think, the broadest, besides the federal sector requirements, broadest for the private sector, is one that requires affirmative action for federal contractors who receive federal funds. And secondly, one that has a requirement, Section 508, for technology accessibility in the federal government. So when our federal government procures hardware and software, other kinds of technologies, they must think about accessibility. That's the A in the DEIA agenda. Of course, we also have workplace non-discrimination legislation that supports non-discrimination across all parts of the employment process, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is now 35 years old, Family Medical Leave Act, which provides the provisions for employers of 50 or more to allow people to take leave for pregnancy leave or health issues for themselves or a family member, Occupational Safety and Health, which has been in place for over 50 years. And at the state level, state workers' compensation legislation, which is purported within each state. There are requirements that are unique to that state. We also have Age Discrimination Employment Act, which has been in place now since 1967 and amended since then. And that is important because with an aging workforce, many people incur disabilities, and we want to keep them in the workplace. So that is all a part of this conversation as well. And finally, we have legislation that protects the rights of veterans returning from service, who may, about a quarter of whom have some kind of residual disability. And so we have legislation to support them. So to start with, that's the big picture at a very broad level of our public policy framework that supports people with disabilities. We also have public employment supports that are at the community level. We have a national, state, federal vocational rehabilitation system. This is the second broad element, is making sure that in our communities that we have support systems for people with disabilities that can help them transition to the workplace. We have, besides that first bullet of 80-some agencies that are national, we have many thousands of community service providers at the local level. We have our focus right now is very much on customized employment to try to support people with more significant disabilities with targeted job identification in specific industries, and supported employment, where we support people in the workplace, helping them gear up to learn tasks with supported employment approach with job coaches that are often funded by our state vocational rehabilitation agencies. Also important, as a part of our community network, are centers for independent living, and each state has some of these. We have about 300 of them across the country, and these provide services that help with community integration as well as with employment, but also to take a look at how housing and transportation is meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities at the community level. And finally, very important, and we're hoping that this will blossom in the coming months, public-private apprenticeships and internships, often that are federally funded or funded by private employers to help people gear up their skills. And we're targeting some that are specifically targeted for people with disabilities in the coming industries. So that's a very quick overview of many of the elements of effective change that help with the integration, independence, and inclusion of people with disabilities. And now I'm going to spend the rest of my time focusing on the area of what can employers do to help us to get people into the workplace, where we have spent a great deal of time at Cornell University focusing. So within that part of those overall arching elements, I like to think across 7 different areas within that workplace focus. That's readying the workplace. What can we do to better assure that the workplace will accept people with disabilities enthusiastically? What can we do to build the talent pipeline and onboarding? What can we do to increase accessibility and accommodation of that workplace? What can we do to build a workplace climate? And what is the critical role of the supervisor in contributing to making that a successful outcome? The importance of thinking beyond just getting someone into the workplace and thinking about retention and giving them an opportunity to advance once in the workplace. The importance of using all of your resources, those inside the organization, which are already there for the rest of our employees, and all those that are in the community that I began to mention a bit ago. And then the importance of scaling and sustainability. We've been at this quite a long time now, and we see many employers enthusiastically starting initiatives, but when leadership changes or economic conditions might change, that these pilot programs and the enthusiasm wane. And so I want to talk a bit about the importance of keeping that in view as you begin these initiatives and support them to continued long life. So first, readying the workplace. And I'll spend a little time on each of those in the time we have together. The most important thing is to start with enlisting top management support. It's critical that someone at the top of the organization says, this is important to our organization, it is not charity, it is something that's embedded in the values of the corporation, and we believe it's good for business. So it should be infused into the strategic goals of the organization so that everyone can see that it's important. It's helpful if the organization articulates specific goals for desired outcomes. It can be a proportion of the workforce over a defined time period. That's most often what we see. But it's important to set a target that everyone can have their eye on. Identify specific targeted areas where talent is needed. We encourage organizations to make sure that this is valuable for you as an organization. So it's taking a look at where do you have turnover, where do you have open positions, where do you have a need for talent. So there's a fit that makes sense for the business case that you're articulating and for the people within the organization. Identify geographic and departmental locations where there not only are available jobs, but where there are internal champions and willing supervisor participants. If you have an affirmative initiative, it greatly helps if you have not only top management support, but support at the local level where you're going to infuse new people into the workplace who might need some supports. The second element that I'm going to talk about is building the talent pipeline and onboarding. So workplace is ready. Hopefully you have top management support, you have jobs that are needing talent, and you have supervisors in geographic areas identified. And now we start building the talent pipeline. First is to assure, again, organizational top management support. Now, I'll articulate this at every phase of this process. And to tap existing hiring networks. All companies already have talent pipelines of where you know there are people, either universities or colleges or technical schools, that are preparing people that have the right skills for your particular job openings within your industry. So start with using those networks to also, but also ask about students with disabilities if you're using colleges and universities or other pipelines, workforce development initiatives. Tap internal resources. Most companies now are beginning to develop employee resource groups, or they're called employee business groups, or colleague network groups, sometimes they're called in the United States. And many of those groups have special interests around certain populations. We see many now targeting people with disabilities in the United States or people who are neurodivergent, and those can be sources of talent. Those individuals who are either family members or who identify as having a disability can help with recruitment, so it's important to engage them in this outreach. Work with local community disability employment. We call them vocational rehabilitation organizations, sourcing qualified talent. This is this network I spoke of 80-some agencies, state by state, but also community service providers. And create a disability inviting and accessible website. We just took a wonderful picture, and in that picture here, we held up words and signs that mean disability inclusion is a part of the priority. And that's what people want to see as job applicants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Accessible in that it's accessible to people with sensory impairments. Develop internships to include people with disabilities, and I'll tell you why that's important in a moment. Inform and educate recruiters and hiring managers that this is coming, that you want them to be more receptive and supportive of applicants with disabilities in that screening process. Review and retool the interview process, which often presents many barriers, and design a disability supportive onboarding process. So I mentioned targeted internships. This is a list, it's a short list of items on a survey that we did with our Society for Human Resource Management in the United States, which has about a 350,000 membership base. We surveyed a subset of people looking at what they were doing around disability employment practices, policies and practices, and then we looked at who had hired and could report hiring people with disabilities in the last year. We found out that company representatives, HR representatives who reported having targeted disability-focused internships that gave people an opportunity to try out the company and the company to try out the person with a disability, it was 6 times more likely that they would have hired a person with a disability in the last year. So it's a very effective practice. It is low risk, often in the eyes of the company and supervisors, and it acculturates the organization to disability inclusion. The next 5 times more likely to have hired is if they had strong senior management commitment, which we talked about. 4 times if they had explicit organizational hiring goals, and 3 times more likely that they would have hired a person with a disability in the last year if they had active recruiting, screening, and interviewing, they had disability was included in their diversity and inclusion plan. As you heard, it's less likely from our prior speakers that occurs. And last, that they have relationships with these community organizations that can source qualified talent that is appropriate for the open positions. Here's a little bit more about websites, and it's important, we found, because we reviewed websites, we talked to job applicants, and we found out this is what people with disabilities are looking for. They want to know that they are wanted in the organization before applying. So a statement from the CEO that this is a part of the business imperative, business strategy, that it's seen as a business case for hiring, and that they have targeted disability hiring goals and are demonstrably measuring progress toward that goal. So there's a target, and someone's saying, and here's how we're doing on that target. This is what people are looking for. It's also on career pages. They told us that these are things that help them decide to apply for the job. That there's messaging that encourages rather than discourages applicants with disabilities to apply. And that can be this robust diversity and inclusion statement that includes disability. It might be employee testimonials. And by that I mean that you already have individuals with disabilities in the organization who have come forward and are willing to say, I work here, it's a great place for me, I'm supported, I'm wanted, you should also apply and try here. I think you'll like it. And job previews. We find that sometimes people will not apply because they're uncertain about the job. They're not sure they have the right qualifications. And so a little more information about the job, text-based, but also sometimes visually showing what's on the job can be very helpful for some applicants. And again, using trained recruiters rather than just AI filters. Often AI filters filter out applicants like people with disabilities. So if you are really serious about trying to get applicants with disabilities in your pipeline, having recruiters who are trained and know this is a part of your business strategy is really important. They help with getting them through that screening process. And we also have found, and this particular study was focusing on people with autism, people who are neurodivergent, that the interview process can be very problematic and that there are ways to streamline that. We interviewed employers who are affirmatively recruiting neurodivergent individuals, neurodivergent job seekers, and also community service providers, and found that there certainly were specific strategies that helped get people through this process. A strategic organizational focus and disability awareness training for HR and the hiring professionals prior to the interviews helped a great deal. Modifying or replacing the existing interview protocols, which most of us are still using and can be problematic for, in this case, neurodivergent individuals who have the right skills, have the right credentials, but find it difficult to get through the interview process. Some of the things we found from employers, from the job seekers, and from the community service providers, they all had similar experiences that told us what to do better was providing interview questions to community partners or interviewees in advance, eliminating open-ended and vague hypothetical interview questions, which many of us have thought was best practice for many years, questions about what would you do if, more behavioral questions than job directly relevant questions. Introducing applicants to the work environment prior to starting the interview as an icebreaker, letting them see the environment in advance. Consider replacing interview panels. Sometimes we walk in and there's 5 or 6 people at the table firing questions at the individual. And so better to have one-on-one or 2-to-1 interviews, and avoiding rapid-fire questioning strategies. People told us, job applicants told us, that sometimes they needed to stop and think about the question that was being asked And too quickly, the interviewer assumed when they paused that they weren't going to be able to answer the question and moved on. So giving the person time is critically important. And allowing opportunities to show technical skills by solving a specific work-relevant problem, a skills-based interview process. And we have seen over the last 10 years, especially for those employers who are seeking to hire neurodivergent individuals for technical areas, that allowing people to demonstrate those skills, either as an individual or as a part of a team over a time period of 1 or 2 days or more, that can be a very effective way of reducing anxiety and allowing people to show that they can do the skills that you're looking for. And we have seen this significantly used in Microsoft and SAP and Hewlett-Packard increasingly to give people a chance to demonstrate skills rather than have to verbally explain their skill abilities. Okay, so 2 down. Now, accessibility and accommodation and what we can consider there. I use both of these words. We talk a great deal about accommodation, but accessibility is really important because it's the bigger picture of having a workplace that's welcoming to all by reducing as many barriers as possible. So it's important to think about universal design and inclusive design. And by universal design, I mean building the use for the greatest number of people possible. So not just making ramps so people with wheelchairs can get in the building, but using things like that for the broadest group of people. I talked about aging workers. Many of the adaptations we make for people with disabilities also are supportive of older workers as well. One of the things we've heard from people with disabilities, that thinking about universal design in advance may eliminate or at least lessen the need for individual accommodation requests. And that's important because as people acquire disabilities, if they're not obvious, sometimes they will not ask for an accommodation because they're uncomfortable sharing about disability. So if we're creating an inclusive workplace already in how we design it, it may eliminate that barrier and allow the person to continue to be productive without having to ask for a specific personal accommodation. We need to think about it more than physical access, but also sensory, information, and technology accessibility. All of our workplaces are driven by technology, and so it is really important to be able to have all these systems accessible to all of our workforce. Inclusive design is important, and that is as you make changes, as you procure equipment, as you think about the workplace of tomorrow, engage people with disabilities in that conversation with you. You have them in your workforce, it's finding them, and it may be in an employee resource group, and engaging them in that process. The accommodation process we think of more as for an individual, and it's very helpful. We had found from research we've conducted with human resource professionals, it's important to have a designated office or person to address accommodation questions, to provide training for supervisors about process and accommodations, to coach about the importance of having an interactive dialogue with people about what they need. That is actually the language in our law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, to have a centralized accommodation fund, to regularly check with the individual about accommodation effectiveness, and to include policies and practices around flexible leaves and remote work. And certainly the Family Medical Leave Act has helped us with that, but also our experience during the pandemic told us that people can work effectively remotely, and it's important to consider that if needed as a possible accommodation. All right, next, workplace climate and supervisor role. So broadly, this is probably one of the most important features or facets to talk about. Having a strategic mindset is the most relevant for promoting a sense of belonging. And that is that the organization at its very foundation recognizes people with disabilities as resourceful, creative thinkers, in part because of the challenges they have overcome from living with a disability. And that's recognized and believed within the organization. That organization, as I just spoke about in the website presentation, demonstrates a salient commitment to disability inclusion. And that can be things like this visible senior management commitment, dedicated staff for disability issues, corporate support of programs for individuals with disabilities, with outside company, with individuals with disabilities within and outside the organization. So within, I gave you the example of employee resource groups, but also those community service organizations, and talking about that on your website and in your internal communications. Inclusion of disability in core values and your diversity mission, and leveraging internal and external partnerships. Partnerships are critically important, preparing supervisors for their role, preparing internal resources to contribute workplace disability support as needed, to engage external resources to further contribute to workplace disability supports if they're needed. A little bit about the business resource groups or employee resource groups. They can be extraordinarily helpful. So having some that focus on disability is very, very useful. It's most effective when there's senior management that lends their support and says this is important, especially if it's someone who has openly said, I'm a person with a disability. Can assist with candidate recruitment, with identifying supervisors, with finding mentors and buddies to help with this process, to identify barriers or issues, but hopefully with finding solutions to barriers. And it can support families or newly diagnosed individuals. It can bring significant business value when product development and marketing is assigned, and that is having focus groups about marketing your products and services, and hopefully even designing them from the front end so they have broader appeal to a wider group of people, including customers with disabilities. And lastly, partnering or networking across ERG groups. We find people with disabilities have intersectional identities, and so getting these conversations going across these employee resource groups that are targeted to different interests can also be enormously helpful in problem solving for the organization. Often we have overlooked the importance. We've talked about employee assistance programs and ERGs. We've overlooked the importance of using internal communications to get messaging across inside the organization and out in the community about these kinds of initiatives. So communications and marketing departments can be extraordinarily valuable in helping to brand build, give a name to or an image to, a symbol to the initiative, leveraging the company intranet to talk about it. So helping with general internal awareness that this is a priority, creating messaging that fits the values of the organization, spotlighting that program on internal and external communication, and helping with event planning using naturally occurring celebrations. In the United States, last month was National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Many companies celebrate that. But more globally, many companies also use their marketing to celebrate the UN International Day of People with Disabilities, which is December 3rd, or the UN Autism Awareness Day, which is April 2nd, and there are many more. So I want to talk a bit about the importance of supervisors. We found out in our research with HR professionals that 60% of people with disabilities go to their supervisor before they go to the human resources department. And that's because that is their person. That is the person they most likely, hopefully, feel most comfortable with sharing with. So equipping supervisors to know how to respond, where the resources are in the company to help with accommodations is critically important. Their role, I cannot say enough about how important their role is in building a sense of really an inclusive climate in the organization. So I spoke about the first two bullets, and I want to mention the third bullet, and that is, it's important in our messaging to supervisors that we convey that this is a business value of the organization, it's good business, it is in the fabric of the organization of what you believe is good practice, and that is a very important message. We found out if that is the message that's conveyed to supervisors, they respond differently than if it is a response to a regulatory requirement. If the information that is provided to them says, we have to do this because the law says we have to do this, rather than we're doing this because this is a part of who we are as a business. And supervisors respond entirely differently when that's the message. Next, retaining and advancing talent. So we have people in the organization. We've built a support structure for accessibility and accommodation, and now we need to think about how to keep people there. So training supervisors on coaching, mentoring, and performance appraisal is really important. Encouraging regular and consistent performance feedback, providing regular evaluation, reevaluation of their accommodations, offering mentoring, coaching, training, project work, and stretch assignments, and facilitating group team project opportunities. And we emphasize that that's a part of every business's good practice to develop their personnel, but often supervisors may overlook individuals with disabilities, assuming that they may not have the skills or they might not have the aspiration. And so it's important to remind supervisors about that. Tracking organizational metrics on compensation, professional development opportunities, advancement, and retention to ensure equal opportunities, very important, and providing effective return to work and disability case management, which many companies have now. They have a case management system that supports people if they have occupational or non-occupational injuries or illnesses. Engaging internal and external supports, and I'll go through this quickly because we've already talked a lot about it. Everybody needs to be a part of disability inclusion. Top management, human resources, employee and labor relations, supervisors and recruiters, the EAP, Employee Assistance Program that provides mental health and sometimes behavioral management supports, employee resource or business groups, health, safety, ergonomics, facilities, and that can be accessibility. It can also be helping with ergonomic issues, and procurement services, so that when you're buying technology on the front end, you're selecting things that have the broadest use possibility and the least need for an accessibility or an accommodation fix. Engaging external resources. So I think I'm eager to hear more about what we have here in the city of Taipei and in Taiwan as a whole, but using national, federal, and state vocational rehabilitation, private-public partnerships that can provide skill building, training, community employment service providers that can provide customized or supported employment, and I'd say also knowing what local medical and mental health clinical services are available, as well as centers for independent living that can provide transportation and housing support. We found, especially working with autistic and neurodivergent individuals who had, this might be their first job, needed supports in housing, finding an apartment once they had a paycheck to help them live independently, or to learn how to drive, so transportation. So having these community networks as a part of your repertoire of supports is really important. And finally, scaling and sustainability. Hopefully with all of the things that you're keeping metrics on across the employment process, you can make an informed judgment about what's working and not working and what needs to be changed as you scale up. And replicating this across other places means looking at your organizational talent needs, looking for champions, looking for internal supports and a pipeline of community service providers that can provide that talent, and building a culture of sustainability. Again, it's the organization saying, look what happened here, and it was so successful. We want to replicate this in other geographic locations or other departments. So, and embedding policies and practices into the organizational systems and fabric of the organization more broadly that is already there, so it lasts over time. In summary, public policy must include protection of disability rights for equitable access and education, workforce and economic development initiatives, employment participation, and civil society participation, support to students in educational settings, provision of national networks of community service providers to provide support for individuals as they move into employment and live independently, support for related research, education, training, and information dissemination, as we're talking about here today and as our representatives will share with us. We need a coordinated community service system at the grassroots level, and we need businesses to be our partners in this process. We would encourage businesses to have affirmative hiring programs for people with disabilities and those who are neurodivergent, to have internships, training, certifications, mentorship for all individuals, including individuals with disabilities, to have inclusive workplace policies and practices, an accommodation process that starts with the application process, and use of internal and external community supports. So a short list of everything we just talked about. And I'm leaving you with examples of employers' initiatives from the United States. There are many resources around youth education programs, which we also are focusing on a great deal now, and some related online resources for employers. And for those of us who like to go to the sources of the research, I have left you with a selection of some of the related research resources. I want to thank you for your attention. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Bruyere. Thank you.